Are the Democrats and the fake news media angry that a beautiful, promising young woman wasn't able to go for a jog on her own university campus without having her head bashed in by an illegal alien? No, they are not. In fact, they would have been perfectly happy to never notice or mention this story at all. The thing they're upset about, far more upset than the actual murder, is that Joe Biden called the murderer correctly an illegal alien. And so he was forced to sit down and do a fake damage control interview on MSNBC where he hemmed and hawed and groveled and profusely apologized to the murderer for calling him the wrong adjective. And then he said, "I don't want to treat any of these people with disrespect." And finally, most shockingly of all, he said that illegal aliens built this country? Did he ever stop to take a moment and clarify that he wasn't apologizing to Laken Riley's alleged killer? No, he did not. You don't need this reporter to tell you, over the course of the last half-century, Joe Biden has built the most notoriously blunder-filled career in the history of American politics. But hey, life is pretty good when you're a senator from a tiny state and you only need 100,000 votes every 6 years in order to be returned to power. And I will forego my normal 17th Amendment rant here because you've all heard it before. The man spent 36 years in the Senate and only authored one major piece of legislation, which was a pretty good piece of legislation, but which he now falls all over himself apologizing for, just like he profusely apologizes for calling Laken Riley's alleged killer correctly an illegal alien. Which is to say, Joe Biden never apologizes when he gets things wrong. He only apologizes for things he got right, which might be the Joe Bidenist thing about Joe Biden. As we all know, it's become something close to an orthodoxy in U.S. politics that the 94 crime bill, the one Joe Biden authored and shepherded all the way to its passage, was a terrible racist monstrosity because it imposed heavier penalties on crack cocaine dealers than it did on powdered cocaine dealers. But does this view withstand basic reasonable scrutiny? No, it does not. It never has. Congress didn't all gather around in 1994 and decide it would be fun to put lots of black men in prison. But as we know all too well, if you want to be admitted to polite society in the third decade of the 21st century and not be shouted down as a filthy white supremacist, then you must take it for granted that if there is any sort of racial disparity in any aspect of the criminal justice system, then systemic racism is the only possible explanation. And the only way of redressing the problem is to empty out the prisons and let violent criminals rampage across the country, raping and murdering our daughters. Is it an impossibly idiotic and self-destructive way of viewing the world? Yes, it is. And nobody is done any favors when we are too afraid to come out and say that. Calling things what they are is never racist, and history has no political agenda. It is just the events that happened. It doesn't exist to be a hobby horse for your current day views on current day topics. Why did the 94 crime bill punish crack dealers more severely than coke dealers? Well, because the crack epidemic had been ravaging American communities for nearly a decade up to that point. Most people agreed that legislative action at the national level was called for in order to ameliorate the problem. If powdered cocaine had been causing a similar epidemic of crime and death and suffering, then they would have increased the penalties for that too. But there never was any powdered cocaine epidemic of which to speak, except maybe among rich people in Miami and Hollywood and New York. Now, does that have much to do with the fact that crack is drastically cheaper and thus more accessible to poor people in the inner cities? Well, of course it freaking does. That's why it caused an epidemic and powdered coke didn't. If Joe Biden actually believed in anything and was capable of speaking the English language intelligibly, it would be easy enough for him to explain this all himself. If he was a man of principle and conviction, as he claims to be, he would say, no, there was nothing racist about that law. We punished crack dealers severely because we had a severe crack problem. It was a good law. It did what we wanted it to do. It got lots of scumbag drug dealers off the streets and into prison where they goddamn well belong. I'm proud to have written it. I would write it again. But what do we get instead? We get mealy-mouthed prevarication, apologies for a racist law that was never racist, performative acts of political self-flagellation. But I guess it's fitting that Biden would be apologizing for the one thing he ever got right. There's some kind of poetic justice in that, I think.